Before the world descended into war, before entire cities were reduced to rubble and millions of lives were taken, a quieter conflict had already begun, one that few people noticed at the time. It was not a battle fought with tanks or planes, but with canvases, sculptures, rare books, gold frames and museum archives. And at the center of it all was a man who once dreamed not of ruling nations, but of being a painter. In 1907, a young Adolf Hitler arrived in Vienna with a folder full of sketches and the belief that his future would unfold inside the grand halls of the Academy of Fine Arts. He imagined himself as a rising star of European culture. Instead, he was rejected. Twice. The admissions board told him his work lacked skill, life, and understanding of the human figure. Those words stayed with him like a wound that never healed. His dream did not just die, it turned into resentment. He began to see the world of art not as a shared human treasure, but as a closed world that had humiliated him. The bitterness he nurtured would one day shape the fate of hundreds of thousands of artworks across Europe, many of which have still never been recovered. Years passed. The failed artist became a homeless drifter, then a soldier in World War I, then a political agitator, then the leader of a rising extremist movement. And as his power grew, so did his belief that art could be used as a weapon. Not simply for beauty, but for ideology, control, and revenge. When Hitler rose to power in 1933, he did not forget the rejection he suffered as a young man. The world of culture would not reject him again, because now, he would decide what culture meant. He created laws defining pure German art and outlawing what he called degenerate art, a term he used for everything he hated: modernism, abstract art, surrealism, expressionism, Jewish artists, politically liberal artists, anyone who challenged tradition, anyone who believed art belonged to all people. And yet, there was a dark paradox. Even the art Hitler labeled as corrupt, impure, or diseased was still valuable. And so it was not destroyed, not entirely. It was stolen. Sold. Hidden. Traded. Turned into profit. Turned into power. To carry out this mission, Hitler created a special art-looting task force, the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, or ERR. Their job was simple: move behind the armies, seize every valuable artwork, and transfer it to the Reich. This was not chaotic robbery. It was organized, bureaucratic, and executed with the precision of a corporation. Paintings were catalogued, numbered, photographed, boxed, and shipped. Every seized item had a file and a signature. A theft was turned into a legal document. And Europe had no idea what was coming. Hitler's art policy was not only about control. It was about legacy. In secret, he began designing what he believed would become the greatest art museum in human history, the future cultural capital of the world, the Führermuseum, to be built in Linz, Austria, his childhood home. The museum would contain the spoils of Europe, from Michelangelo to Rembrandt, from Raphael to Vermeer. It would not simply display art. It would prove, in Hitler's mind, that he, not the academy that rejected him, was now the ultimate authority on culture. The boy they refused to let inside the art world would now own it. But Hitler was not the only one collecting. Hermann Göring, his second-in-command, turned the theft of art into a personal shopping spree. He visited plundered repositories like showrooms, pointing at masterpieces and having them loaded into trucks for his private mansion, his private train, and his private vault. While millions were starving, Göring was choosing silk wallpaper colors for a room that would house stolen Rembrandts. In some cases, he even stole from the errant thieves. The Nazis were not just erasing people, they were erasing ownership, history, and identity through art. The first major wave of looting began in Austria in 1938. Jewish collections, private galleries, university archives, royal estates, church treasures, even items hanging in everyday family homes were taken. In Vienna alone, more than 50,000 artworks were stolen in the first months. Every item was documented. Every object was given a number. Every number meant something had been taken from someone who would never get it back. Thousands of families fled the country with nothing but suitcases, leaving behind fortunes in art that would be seized before they even reached the border. But the scale of looting that took place in Austria was nothing compared to what would happen when the war expanded into Poland, Belgium, the Netherlands, and especially France. When the Nazis entered Paris, they did not immediately destroy the museums. They emptied them. The Rothschilds, the Wildensteins, the Bernheims, families who had collected art for generations, lost everything within days. Paintings were pulled from walls, sculptures hauled away, libraries stripped, safes cracked open, crates sealed and stamped with swastikas. The Nazis did not steal impulsively. They stole according to lists. Before they even crossed borders, they knew what they wanted: specific paintings, specific collections, specific names. Art historians were forced to work for the looters, identifying which pieces were most valuable so they could be taken first. If a work was considered degenerate, it was sold on the international market for profit. If it was considered masterful, it was reserved for Hitler or Göring. This was the largest cultural theft in human history, far bigger than the Egyptians, Romans, or British had ever pulled off. And most of the world didn't realize it was happening until it was too late. By 1943, the Nazis had taken more than 500,000 artworks, so many that there was no longer space in castles and government buildings to store them. So they built underground vaults, filling salt mines, tunnels, bunkers, and mountain fortresses with stolen masterpieces. Hidden from bombs. Hidden from discovery. Hidden for a future in which Hitler believed he would rule the world and display Europe's culture as his trophy. But history did not go the way he planned. The same year the mines were being filled, the Allies began advancing. Hitler issued a final order: if the Reich failed, the art was to be destroyed so that no one else could have it. If I cannot possess it, he said, then no one will. What saved a portion of Europe's cultural heritage was not Nazi mercy, but Nazi logistical delay. The war moved faster than the destruction orders could be carried out. When American forces finally reached the mines, what they found shocked them. Stacked wooden crates reaching from floor to ceiling. Gold-framed masterpieces wrapped in sheets. Sculptures buried in straw. Boxes of jewelry, Torah scrolls, church relics, Renaissance manuscripts, looted archives. The scale was beyond imagination. It was not just theft. It was cultural amputation. But even after all the mines were opened and all the crates were counted, something terrifying became clear: not everything was there. Thousands of paintings were missing. Sculptures disappeared. Private collections never resurfaced. The Nazis had not stored everything, they had traded some, burned some, smuggled some, hid some, and possibly buried some. And so the war ended, but the search for the stolen art did not. Even today, more than 80 years later, over 100,000 artworks stolen by the Nazis have never been found. Some hang illegally in private homes, some sit quietly in museums that have never verified their history, some were destroyed without record, and some, many, are still out there, waiting to be rediscovered in attics, vaults, bank storage rooms, or underground hiding places that have never been opened. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the world understood that another war had begun, but what it did not understand was that this war was not only about land, territory, or military dominance. It was also about culture, about erasing entire identities, rewriting history, and claiming the heritage of other nations as the property of the Reich. As German forces advanced, so did a parallel army: art experts, archivists, museum agents, and Nazi officers who followed the military lines not to fight, but to seize. They did not arrive with guns raised, but with lists. Lists of paintings, sculptures, manuscripts, libraries, religious treasures, ancient artifacts, family heirlooms, compiled long before the invasion. The Nazis already knew what they wanted before they arrived. They were not stealing impulsively. They were executing a plan. The first great wave of looting in Poland began with the emptying of museums and private estates. Priceless medieval altarpieces, religious icons, royal jewels, and entire palace collections vanished within weeks. Jewish-owned galleries were stripped clean. Churches were raided. Priests watched as centuries-old sacred objects were boxed and hauled away. The Nazis did not believe they were stealing, they believed they were reclaiming what was rightfully Aryan. Their racial ideology was not just about people. It was about culture. If something was great, they believed it belonged to them. If it was created by someone they considered inferior, they believed they had the right to take it and possess it. From Poland, the looting machine expanded into Western Europe. Belgium and the Netherlands fell quickly, and with them some of the greatest art collections in the world. The Nazis seized multiple Vermeers, Rembrandts, portraits by Rubens, Dutch Golden Age works, Flemish tapestries, and rare books that had not left their libraries in centuries. Jewish collectors were forced to sign legal transfer documents under threat of deportation. Many were sent to concentration camps the same week their art was taken. Some families tried to hide their collections in walls, behind false floors, or buried in gardens, but the ERR had teams of experts trained to find hidden compartments, fake storage labels, and sealed rooms. It was not enough to hide great art, one had to hide it from people who already knew it existed. But it was in France that the operation reached its highest intensity. When German forces marched into Paris in June 1940, the art world held its breath. The Louvre had already emptied most of its galleries, transporting thousands of paintings, including the Mona Lisa, out of the city under cover of night. The curators hid them in castles, storage barns, and remote monasteries. They removed frames, coded locations, and even cleaned the soot from fireplaces to erase evidence of hidden vaults. They were not just protecting France's heritage, they were buying time. However, the Nazis were not discouraged. If anything, they saw it as a challenge. They took over the Jeu de Paume Museum and turned it into their art headquarters in France. What had once been a public gallery became a sorting center for stolen masterpieces. The walls were lined with confiscated works, categorized into three main groups: pieces reserved for Hitler, pieces reserved for Göring, and pieces marked for sale. This was the industrialization of art theft. Each day, crates arrived from Parisian homes, wealthy Jewish apartments, abandoned bank vaults, and seized safe deposit boxes. The Nazis documented everything, not because they respected the art, but because they wanted to control it. They photographed each piece, stamped it, registered ownership transfer, and sent it to Germany. Even crime became paperwork. Even robbery became administration. The Rothschild family, one of the most influential banking and art dynasties in Europe, lost more than 5,000 pieces, including antique furniture, silver, manuscripts, and entire rooms of artworks. The Bernheim-Jeune collection disappeared. The WWII collection was stripped bare. The Wildenstein family lost more than 2,000 paintings. Marc Chagall's personal works were seized, packed, and labeled like cargo. Henri Matisse's daughter watched Nazi officers carry away canvases signed by her father, unable to do anything but stand silent. The Nazis were not just removing objects, they were erasing legacies, stripping families of memory and identity. And yet, while the world saw only destruction, the Nazis saw opportunity. They held private viewings for Göring and high-ranking officials, where masterpieces looted hours earlier were displayed in candlelit rooms like luxury merchandise. Göring would stroll the halls wearing silk robes, selecting works in the same way a child points at pastries in a bakery window. His personal train, known as the salon car, was remodeled into a traveling art gallery so he could admire stolen pieces while crossing Europe in comfort. While civilians stood in ration lines, Göring was redecorating his estate with stolen Rembrandts, Gobelins tapestries, and 17th-century Dutch landscapes. But the most chilling part of the French looting was not the scale, it was the silence. There were no public auctions, no newspaper notices, no official records given to French institutions. Everything was done through sealed documents, private railway transports, and coded shipments. No one knew how much was being taken because the Nazis controlled the information flow. And the victims were being deported or killed before they ever had the chance to protest. As the war continued, the Nazis expanded their reach beyond Western Europe. They seized art in Yugoslavia, Greece, Italy, and even Northern Africa. Religious treasures, archaeological artifacts, ancient mosaics, anything that had value, cultural or symbolic, was at risk. Entire cultural identities were uprooted and sent to Germany, packaged in wooden crates marked, property of the Führer. But the most haunting truth of the Nazi looting operation was this: almost nothing was accidental. The Nazis believed that whoever controlled culture controlled history. If the Reich survived, schoolchildren in the future would learn from textbooks illustrated with stolen paintings. Museums would show stolen works without ever acknowledging their past. The cultural memory of nations would fade, replaced by the version the Nazis approved. What made the theft so devastating was not just the loss of objects, but the loss of context. A painting is not just an image, it is proof that someone lived, created, loved, and mattered. When the Nazis stole art, they were not only taking wealth. They were severing cultural lineage, turning a masterpiece into an orphan. A painting that loses its owner becomes a ghost. And even in the middle of the war, the Nazis already planned what would happen after final victory. They prepared lists of which countries would be allowed to keep art, which nations would have theirs permanently relocated, and which people would never again be associated with their cultural heritage. The Nazis were not just stealing the present. They were rewriting the future. But every empire has limits, and time was running out. As Allied forces approached from the west and Soviet forces from the east, the Nazis began to move the art again, this time deeper into Germany, into mountains, mines, bunkers, tunnels, anywhere they believed the treasures might survive bombing. They believed that even if the country was reduced to ashes, the art would live on to rebuild a new Reich someday. And yet, just like in Part 1, the world would soon learn that not everything was saved, not everything was found, and not everything remained intact. The biggest secrets of the looting, the final destinations of thousands of missing artworks, would become one of the greatest mysteries in modern history. Because the war was ending. The vaults were full. The documents were incomplete. And the owners were gone. What remained was a cultural crime so large that even today, we still have not mapped all of it. As the war turned against Germany in 1943 and 1944, the Nazis began to understand a truth they had spent years denying: the Thousand-Year Reich was not guaranteed to last 1,000 days more. The Allied invasion of Italy, the collapse of the Eastern Front, the bombing of German cities, everything pointed toward a future in which Hitler's empire would be forced to defend, not expand. And with that shift came a new phase in the story of the stolen art, not the acquisition, but the concealment. The looting had been bold, public, even triumphant. The hiding was the opposite: secretive, frantic, improvised. What had once been carefully planned transports on luxury trains became emergency convoys on bombed roads, carrying priceless cultural treasures into remote corners of the Reich. The Nazis were no longer stealing art for the purpose of displaying it. They were stealing it to keep it from being found. They turned salt mines into museums, railway tunnels into vaults, mountain caves into cultural tombs. The most famous of these was the Altausee salt mine in Austria, a sprawling underground labyrinth large enough to hold entire cities of art. It contained more than 6,500 paintings, including works by Michelangelo, Raphael, Vermeer, Jan van Eyck, Titian, and Leonardo da Vinci's famed Madonna of Bruges. The mine was guarded like a military base, yet it was never meant to be seen. It was meant to be waited for, like a time capsule for a future that would never arrive. The idea was simple: if Germany survived, the art would be brought out and placed into Hitler's planned Führermuseum in Linz. If Germany fell, the art would be preserved for a day when a new Reich could rise again. To the Nazis, history was not a matter of if, but of when. They believed that someday, the world would belong to them, and when that day came, the stolen art would emerge like buried treasure, restoring the Aryan story to glory. It was not just theft. It was prophecy. But the hiding places were not limited to Austria. In Merkers, Germany, the Kaiserode mine was transformed into a vault filled not only with art but with 8,198 gold bars, sacks of currency, and the assets of the Reichsbank, one of the greatest concentrations of wealth in modern history. Inside the mine were also more than 400 tons of personal belongings stolen from concentration camp prisoners, watches, wedding rings, gold teeth, eyeglasses, children's jewelry. If the mines of Austria were underground museums, the mines of Merkers were underground graves of human memory. Elsewhere, the Nazis hid art in medieval castles, abandoned breweries, and even in private family estates that had pledged loyalty to Hitler. The depth of secrecy was so extreme that many German officials themselves did not know where the most valuable pieces were stored. Storage maps were handwritten. Inventories were split across different agencies. The ERR and Göring's personal art unit kept separate lists. And because the Nazis never believed they could lose, they never created a complete master index of everything they had stolen. That single detail would become one of the greatest historical setbacks of the 20th century. Tens of thousands of stolen artworks were hidden so well that even after the war, no one could find them again. But even as the hiding operations continued, something darker began to take shape. Hitler knew that if the Allies captured the art, they would return it to the nations and people it had been stolen from, undoing the ideological victory he had spent years constructing. In his eyes, if Germany did not own the art, then no one should. So he issued the Nero decree: if the Reich fell, all cultural assets under Nazi control were to be destroyed. It was total cultural suicide. The decree was not symbolic. Explosives were carried into the Altaussee mine. The tunnels were prepared for demolition. Priceless paintings and sculptures would have been buried forever under thousands of tons of rock. The Führermuseum would have died before ever being born. Hitler was not preserving art for the future at this point. He was preparing to erase it. But something happened that no one expected. German workers, miners, not soldiers, disobeyed Hitler's order. They sabotaged the explosives, lied to Nazi officers, replaced real bombs with fake ones, and refused to let the treasure be destroyed. Their rebellion was not political. It was moral. They believed that even in defeat, culture should not die. Meanwhile, outside the hidden vaults, the war was collapsing. The Allied bombings turned entire German cities into rubble. The Soviets pushed through Poland and Eastern Europe, discovering looted treasures left behind in abandoned trains and half-empty bunkers. The Americans moved into Western Germany, capturing towns that held secret art depots without even knowing they existed. And then, slowly, the world changed. The Nazis began fleeing with crates. Some tried to smuggle works into Switzerland. Others attempted private deals, trading stolen art for safe passage. Some burned documents, hoping to erase their involvement. A few destroyed artworks intentionally so they would not be recovered by unworthy hands. One officer threw stolen paintings into a river before shooting himself beside them. The looting that began with pride was ending with panic. The Allied armies began hearing rumors, whispers from captured officers, coded notes, half-burned paperwork, maps scribbled on cigarette wrappers. The art had not been destroyed. It had been hidden. And somewhere out there were vaults filled with the world's cultural history, waiting. But there was something else happening too. The Soviets, who had suffered more losses than any other country, 1/3 of their museums destroyed, whole libraries burned, were not planning to return what they recovered. They formed the trophy brigades, whose job was to seize German art and bring it back to the USSR as compensation. In their view, it was not looting. It was justice. Stolen treasures were taken from Berlin, Dresden, and Leipzig and locked away in Moscow and Leningrad. Much of it has still never been returned. In a war where everyone had been robbed, everyone began to believe they had the right to take something back. So by the end of 1945, the situation was not simple at all. Some art had been recovered. Some had been destroyed. Some had been moved by the Nazis. Some had been claimed by the Soviets. Some had disappeared into private hands. Some was sitting in mines the Allies had not yet found. And tens of thousands of pieces, paintings, manuscripts, sculptures, ancient coins, Torah scrolls, entire libraries, were simply missing. Not burned, not destroyed, just gone. Invisible, undocumented, silent. That is what makes the next part of the story both heroic and tragic. The war for Europe was ending. But the war for its memory was just beginning. When the Allied armies crossed into Europe, they were not only fighting a military enemy, they were entering a world where history itself had been broken apart, boxed, crated, and hidden. What they did not yet know was that they would soon be fighting a second war, a war to save culture before it vanished forever. This mission would not be led by generals, but by scholars, museum curators, art historians, archaeologists, architects, professors, and librarians. They were called the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives Program, known to history simply as the Monuments Men. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense, though they wore uniforms and held ranks. Most of them were middle-aged. Some were too old to carry rifles. Many had never imagined stepping onto a battlefield. They came from Harvard, the National Gallery, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Oxford, Princeton, the Louvre. Before the war, they had spent their lives studying paintings, not rescuing them. But Roosevelt and Churchill understood something: if civilization was to be rebuilt after the war, it could not be rebuilt on ashes. Culture mattered. Beauty mattered. Memory mattered. So the Monuments Men were given a mission: to protect churches, monuments, archives, libraries, and most urgently, to find the stolen art before it was destroyed or lost forever. They had no map, no central database, often no support from frontline commanders, and almost no idea what awaited them. What they did have were fragments, rumors, interrogation statements, coded letters, abandoned crates, lists found in burned offices, labels torn from frames, and the testimony of terrified museum staff who had been forced to cooperate with the Nazis. The first discoveries shocked them. Inside castles they found entire rooms filled with looted paintings stacked frame to frame, sometimes 12 layers deep. In abandoned train cars, they found crates full of Jewish religious manuscripts, stolen Torah scrolls, and private family archives seized from people who had been deported to camps. In Munich, they found Hitler's own personal collection, more than 1,500 stolen works catalogued with obsessive detail, evidence not only of theft but of ideology. But the true breakthrough came when the Allies captured records from the ERR, the Nazi art looting task force. Inside a paper-stuffed basement, the Monuments Men found a nearly complete inventory of all art stolen from France. It contained photos, dimensions, owners' names, and codes showing where the art had been sent. This was the key: the Nazis had looted in order, with paperwork. And paperwork could be traced. That is how they learned the truth about the mines. At first, the idea sounded unbelievable: 15th-century paintings stored in the same tunnels where miners dug salt and metal. But as interrogations continued, German prisoners repeated the same locations: Merseburg, Siegen, Graslitz, Hungen, Altaussee, Merkers. Each name marked a vault of memory waiting underground. The Monuments Men reported their findings to Eisenhower, who issued a remarkable order: Allied troops were forbidden to destroy culturally significant sites unless absolutely necessary for survival. It was the first military directive in history to protect art during a war. Then came Merkers. In April 1945, U.S. tanks rolled into the town, expecting resistance. What they found instead was a frightened civilian who confessed that there was something important in the mine, but he did not know what. When the Monuments Men arrived and descended into the darkness, their flashlights revealed an impossible sight: gold bars stacked like bricks, bags of currency piled like sand, paintings leaning against salt walls, crates marked with museums from across Europe, and, even worse, evidence of death camps, dental gold from murdered prisoners. This was not just theft. It was an economy of plunder. But Merkers was only the beginning. As the Allies moved deeper into Germany and Austria, more mines were uncovered, each filled with treasures beyond imagination. In Siegen, they found the crown jewels of Prussia. In Heilbronn, hundreds of Renaissance paintings. In Bernterode, entire stone monuments and the bronze equestrian statue of Frederick the Great, dismantled and hidden in darkness. But nothing compared to Altaussee. Altaussee was the crown vault of the Reich, the final resting place of Hitler's dream museum. It held Michelangelo's Bruges Madonna, Vermeer's The Astronomer, Jan van Eyck's Adoration of the Mystic Lamb, priceless tapestries, jewels, archives, medieval reliquaries, and more than 6,500 pieces of cultural treasure. When the monument's men entered, they were confronted not only by the sheer quantity of art but by how close it had come to destruction. They found crates stacked beside massive explosives, more than enough to collapse the mine forever. And then, something remarkable, a handwritten note from Austrian miners explaining how they had defied Nazi orders to blow up the vault. They had risked execution not for a country, not for politics, but for civilization itself. Piece by piece, room by room, mine by mine, the monument's men photographed, documented, recreated, and began returning the art to the nations and families it had been stolen from. But the task was astronomical. More than 5 million cultural objects had been displaced during the war. Paintings were easy to identify, but books, Torah scrolls, personal letters, silverware, wedding portraits, heirlooms, children's drawings from Jewish families sent to Auschwitz, who owned those? Who was left to claim them? So the monument's men created collecting points, massive sorting centers in Munich, Wiesbaden, and Offenbach. There, art was cleaned, catalogued, restored, and stored until rightful owners could be found. French, Dutch, Polish, and Belgian curators traveled to Germany in tears, reclaiming works they never believed they would see again. Strangers who had never met worked side by side, bound by one belief: culture belonged to humanity, not to dictators. But not everything was recovered. Some crates had already been shipped out of Europe. Some had been burned by retreating SS troops. Some had been stolen not once, but twice, looted by Nazis, then taken by Soviet trophy brigades, hidden in Russia where they remain to this day. Some disappeared into private estates and would not resurface until decades later in auction houses, bank vaults, or anonymous collections. That is the bitter truth of this chapter. The monument's men saved thousands of works, but they could not save all of them. Tens of thousands remain missing. Some are lost forever. Some are waiting. Some are hanging right now in the homes of people who still have no idea what they possess. The mission of the monument's men did not end in 1945. It continues today, in courtrooms, in archives, in auction disputes, in the database of the FBI art crime team, and in the quiet grief of families whose cultural identities were erased. The Nazis stole more than paintings. They stole memory. And recovering memory is a war that has lasted far longer than World War II itself. By the end of 1946, more than a year after the war had ended, the monument's men had successfully recovered and returned hundreds of thousands of stolen artworks. Museums in Paris, Amsterdam, Warsaw, Krakow, Florence, Vienna, Brussels, and The Hague were slowly rebuilding their collections. Newspapers around the world published dramatic photos of masterpieces being carried out of salt mines, lifted by cranes, unwrapped from crates, and placed back into galleries. For many, it looked like the story had reached its resolution, a triumph of justice over destruction. But that was an illusion. The real story was more complicated, more painful, and still unfinished. Even after the mines were emptied and the war was over, a vast amount of stolen art never returned home. Some pieces disappeared in the chaos of retreat. Some were burned by the SS to erase evidence. Some were secretly taken by Soviet forces and locked away behind the Iron Curtain. Some were reclaimed illegally by individuals who wanted trophies, not justice. And some simply vanished, no records, no witnesses, no trace. They became what historians now call the missing works. The number is staggering. At least 100,000 artworks are still missing today, along with millions of books, manuscripts, archives, religious objects, and personal cultural belongings seized from families who, in most cases, never survived to reclaim them. The scale of loss cannot be understood in numbers alone. Every missing painting is not simply a theft, it is a severed story. A frame without a family. A memory with no one left to speak for it. But the reasons so much art was never recovered are complex, and they began immediately after the war. The first problem was destruction. Entire shipments of stolen art were bombed during Allied raids, burned in train stations, or abandoned in attics and barns that later caught fire. Some works were deliberately destroyed by the Nazis before surrender. One SS officer ordered the burning of dozens of Jewish-owned paintings because, as he wrote, no Jew will ever reclaim what belongs to the Reich. The loss was not accidental. It was ideological. The second problem was the Soviet Union. While the Monuments men focused on recovering art for restitution, the Red Army saw art as reparations, payment for the cultural devastation Hitler had inflicted on the USSR. Soviet forces seized more than 2 million objects from Germany, including some that Germany had previously stolen from other nations. Many of those pieces were hidden in Russian museums, recorded in secret archives, and declared war trophies. To this day, Russia refuses to return many of them, arguing that the moral right of compensation outweighs the legal right of ownership. Michelangelo's Sitting Boy, the amber room panels of Tsarskoye Selo, Dutch and German masterworks taken from Berlin museums, these remain locked in Russian vaults, unseen for decades. The third problem was silence. When Jewish survivors returned, or when the families of those who did not survive attempted restitution, they faced a legal nightmare. Many had no documents proving ownership, their homes had been seized, their possessions inventoried by Nazis who destroyed the records before fleeing, or worst of all, their entire families had been murdered, leaving no heirs to speak for them. Some survivors were advised not to pursue restitution because it was too complicated, too expensive, or because governments preferred to return art to institutions rather than individuals. In 1952, a German bureaucrat told a Holocaust survivor, "No one is alive to prove this belonged to you. Therefore, we cannot return it." That was the final wound, not the theft itself, but the denial that followed it. In many cases, art was returned to museums instead of families, meaning works looted from Jewish homes are still hanging today in European galleries, labeled as unknown owner, instead of stolen property. The fourth problem was corruption. Not everyone who recovered art wanted to return it. Allied soldiers took paintings, sculptures, jewelry, and books as souvenirs. Some were low-ranking troops who did not understand the value of what they carried, others were high-ranking officers who knew exactly what they were doing. A few even justified it, arguing that if the Nazis had looted Europe, the Americans were entitled to souvenir culture. One American officer filled an entire shipping crate with stolen art and mailed it home. He was never prosecuted. His family sold the pieces decades later. Then there were the private collectors. As Europe tried to rebuild, the black market exploded. Stolen works resurfaced in Switzerland, Brazil, Argentina, Spain, countries where ex-Nazis fled and carried stolen art with them. Some smuggled paintings rolled into shipping tubes, others hidden behind false walls, others traded for cash, weapons, or silence. Many of those works entered private collections where they remain invisible to this day. Detectives tracking them later used one phrase over and over: "The walls have galleries we will never see." But the most haunting cases are those where the art is not destroyed, not stolen again, not in storage, but simply lost, sitting, perhaps, in someone's attic, office, vault, or family inheritance, completely unidentified. A painting signed by a Dutch master could be hanging above a fireplace right now, its owner unaware that it was once taken from a Jewish home during a midnight raid in 1942. A gold religious artifact could be locked in a bank box, its history erased under new paperwork. A missing Da Vinci drawing could be rolled inside a tube, forgotten inside a file cabinet, protected not by security but by ignorance. Today, museums face a reckoning. Hundreds of institutions, especially in Europe and the United States, are now researching the provenance gap the missing years between 1933 and 1945 when ownership records vanish. The truth is uncomfortable. Some of the world's most respected museums are displaying works that were once looted, and only in recent years have they begun to admit it. In 1998, the Washington Principles on Nazi-confiscated art pushed for transparency and restitution, but participation was voluntary. Some governments cooperated. Others stalled. Some museums resisted, claiming that returning art would damage national heritage. But what is national heritage built on stolen foundations? In the last 20 years, a new kind of detective has emerged: provenance researchers. Their job is not to study the art itself, but its path through history. They search through Nazi archives, survivor testimonies, shipping logs, gallery sales, estate inventories, even handwriting analysis on the backs of frames. And sometimes, after decades, a match appears. A sticker from a Jewish gallery in Paris. A coded catalog number from Goring's collection. A burned corner revealing a museum stamp that was thought destroyed. When one of these lost pieces is identified, it is not simply a legal victory. It is a resurrection. Families who thought everything was gone suddenly hold a photograph of the painting that once hung in their grandparents' dining room. A grandfather who died in Auschwitz has a memory returned to the world. A daughter sees the handwriting of a mother she never met on the back of a canvas. But restitution is not just emotional. It is political. Every recovered artwork forces a question: who decides the fate of cultural property after genocide? Should a museum keep a masterpiece because the public deserves to see it? Or should it be returned to the descendants of the people who died owning it? Is culture a shared treasure, or a personal right? There is one more problem: not all families want the art returned. Some, upon inheriting a looted piece, refuse possession. They say, "We do not want objects. We want the people who were taken from us." A number of families have donated returned works directly to museums with one request: that the label include the truth. That it say the name of the family. That it say the Nazis stole it. That history be shown, not erased. Because this is the final lesson of missing art: it is not only about beauty, or money, or ownership. It is about memory. The Nazis understood that to destroy a people, you do not only kill them. You erase their culture, their books, their music, their archives, their portraits, their heirlooms, the objects that say, "We were here." That is why the recovery continues. That is why the missing works still matter. That is why the story is not over. The war for Europe's art began in 1933. The war for Europe's memory is still being fought today. The war ended in 1945, but the story of the stolen art did not end with it. In many ways, the real search was only beginning. The battlefields were silent, the camps were liberated, the Reich was gone, but the cultural wounds it inflicted were still wide open. In basements, libraries, attics, bank vaults, private collections, anonymous auction houses, forgotten storage rooms, and government archives across the world, the ghosts of that stolen history remain. And for the last 80 years, people have been trying to bring them home. The hunt has taken many forms. Lawyers, archivists, Interpol agents, FBI art crime teams, museum researchers, private investigators, family descendants, and volunteers have all joined a search that has no single leader and no final deadline. There is no blueprint for recovery, no central database that contains every lost object, no universal agreement on what justice means. Every case is its own story. Every artwork is its own mystery. Every restitution is its own small victory against oblivion. Some of the art has resurfaced suddenly, without warning. A missing Monet turns up at a Swiss auction house. A Renoir, stolen in 1941 from a Jewish collector in Paris, is discovered hanging in the living room of a German family who insists they had no idea where it came from. A Degas drawing, taken from a French museum, reappears in a London gallery during a routine provenance check. A Roman silver vessel looted by the SS is found in the basement of a wealthy businessman who died and left no will. Each time a lost work emerges, history shifts slightly. And each time, we are reminded of a truth: the past is not gone. It is only waiting. But the search is not romantic. Most of the work is slow, frustrating, and exhausting. Files are missing. Witnesses are dead. Records were falsified or destroyed. Museums that once denied ownership now admit gaps in their archives, but gaps are not proof. Families must hire lawyers to fight cases that take decades and cost more than the value of the art itself. A survivor who lost everything in 1942 may spend the last years of life battling not Nazis, but bureaucracy. The legal world has struggled with this unique problem. In most theft cases, the statute of limitations eventually expires. But what is the time limit for genocide? Should a nation keep a stolen painting because 70 years have passed? Should a museum be allowed to say, "Too much time has gone by," when the reason for the delay is mass murder? These are not art questions. They are moral questions. Some countries responded with action. Germany created databases and restitution offices. The United States formed the Art Crime Team. The Netherlands established the Restitutions Committee. France launched the Rose Valland Initiative, named after the woman who secretly documented the Nazi theft of French art during the war. Austria passed laws forcing museums to review every object acquired between 1933 and 1945. But many of these efforts came late, decades after most survivors were gone. And yet, even now, new discoveries continue. In 2010, a man in Munich named Cornelius Gerlet was found to be hiding more than 1,200 stolen artworks in his apartment: Picasso, Matisse, Renoir, Chagall, Liebermann, the lost collection of his father Hildebrand Gerlet, a dealer who had worked for the Nazis. The story stunned the world. It proved that the missing art was not a legend of the past. It was real, it was hidden, and it was still out there. After Gerlet's death, another 200 works were found in a second home. Some were returned. Others are still under dispute. In 2018, a Jewish family finally recovered a Pissarro painting that had been looted by the Nazis and later displayed, without apology, at an American museum for 70 years. The museum fought the case, arguing that returning the work would deny the public a masterpiece. The judge disagreed. "Justice," he wrote, "is not a museum label, it is the correction of a wrong." In 2021, a lost Klimt painting stolen from a Jewish collector in Vienna resurfaced in a private European collection. It had been hidden for more than 80 years. Its value was estimated at more than $50 million. The family did not sell it. They loaned it to a museum with one condition: that the wall label tell the truth about what happened in 1938. Because that is the final battle, not just finding the art, but telling the story honestly. For decades, museums used careful language: displaced, lost during wartime, acquired from unknown sources. Today, the wording is changing. Labels are beginning to say what really happened: confiscated from Jewish owners during the Nazi occupation, taken under duress, transferred as part of Aryanization policies, stolen by agents of the Reich. The wall text is becoming part of the restitution. But there is a deeper question beneath all of this: why does it matter? Why spend decades searching for paintings when so many lives were lost? Why fight for art when people were murdered? The answer is simple: because the Nazis understood that destroying a people meant destroying more than bodies. It meant erasing identity, history, culture, memory. The looting was not an accessory to genocide, it was a part of it. And every act of recovery is an act of resistance against that erasure. A painting returned is not just a painting returned. It is a page of history restored to the world. It is a declaration that the victims existed. That they owned things. That they lived and chose and dreamed before they were taken. That their homes were real. That their loss was real. That the theft was real. Every restitution is a reminder that even if the Nazis tried to rewrite the past, they failed. There is another reason the search continues: because some of the missing works are masterpieces of civilization. Raphael's Portrait of a Young Man, stolen from Poland, has not been seen since 1945. It may be destroyed, or it may be hanging right now in a private room, seen only by a few eyes. Caravaggio's Nativity with St. Francis and St. Lawrence, stolen in 1969 by the Sicilian Mafia after being looted during the war, has never been recovered. Thousands of works by lesser-known artists may never be found at all, not because they are less important, but because they belong to people who did not survive to claim them. That is the future of the hunt, not museums, not masterpieces, but family history. The last survivors of the Holocaust are fading. Soon no one will remain who remembers the house, the room, the wall, the day the painting was taken. The children and grandchildren who inherit the search do so not out of ownership, but out of duty. They are not claiming art. They are claiming the right to say, "This belonged to my family before the world took everything from us." And still, the hunt goes on. In archive rooms in Berlin. In auction databases in London. In storage facilities in Sao Paulo. In bank vaults in Zurich. In customs seizures in New York. In dusty files in Moscow no one is allowed to open. In the memory of a single photograph found in a shoebox. In the serial number on the back of a frame. In the handwritten initials of a mother who died in 1943. The story does not end with recovery. It ends when the world finally agrees that culture is not spoils of war, not a trophy of conquest, not a possession of power, but a shared record of humanity. Until then, the vaults remain only half opened. The files are still incomplete. The missing works still wait. The search still continues. And somewhere, perhaps behind a locked door, perhaps in a dusty attic, perhaps on a wall where no one asks questions, the lost art of a stolen world still hangs in silence, waiting for the day someone recognizes it, names it, and brings it home.